Good afternoon. Welcome to ZEF, the Center for Development Research. I welcome you to this panel debate discussion. I'm Joachim von Braun from ZEF. We have a big panel of great panelists. We will ask them to briefly introduce topics related to our agenda. Let me just make a few introductory remarks. The Secretary General of the United Nations, day before yesterday, said, I quote, we shall define a post-2015 development agenda, including with, I underline, a single set of goals for sustainable development, a single set of goals. And that we hope will address the complex challenges of this era. Well, that sounds very general, very simple, very Secretary General type language, but a single set of goals is a tall order. Let's see what our panel thinks. The UN General Assembly these days, in their 68th set of sessions, is debating the agenda called the Post-2015 Development Agenda, Setting the Stage. That sounds almost like our topic. Our theme today is human and sustainable development goals. Where will they bring us, and how can research contribute? Well, we don't want to have a general debate. We are not the United Nations here. We are a research institute, a science-related center. So, while we acknowledge that governments, civil society, business need to be engaged in this debate, the research community too has to have a voice and has to help, in my opinion, because goals tend to compete. Sometimes they are synergistic, but they tend to compete for resources. There are trade-offs, going for this goal or that set of goals. Secondly, goals need instruments in order to be meaningful. And that, again, is a complex issue. What set of instruments for which goals? Simply postulating energizing goals, development goals, will not be enough. It's also important. So research must help to clarify conflicts between goals and efficiency and equity relationships between goals and instruments. Our great panel will be starting with a presentation by Francis Stewart, professor at Oxford. Francis has been very much engaged in development agenda debate, in publications, a book last year already coming early, setting the stage on what goals next. Francis will be followed by Tanya Rödiger-Vorwerk from the Federal Ministry for Development Cooperation and the BMZ here in Bonn. Tanya Forward has been supporting, as head of the office of former President Köhler, his role in the high-level panel of experts advising UN Secretary General on the development agenda, a very important document. I believe there are some briefing documents out there at the table. Thank you for bringing those. You will tell us about next steps in the agenda debate and what this very important high-level panel was arguing for. Thereafter, Bina Agarwal from India, professor at University of Manchester, will give her comments. And Bina's focus of research and of engagement and political debate is very much in the field of gender, environment, natural resource management in relation to poverty. Ernest Aryeetey is not yet here. I said he might come in shortly. We have Carolina Vera. Carolina is a professor at the Center for Atmospheric and Oceanic Research in Argentina, and she will address the environmental goal issues from a climate change perspective. And last not least, Christian Borgemeister, our new colleague at ZEF, Director of the Department for Ecology and Resource Management, will ask questions such as how can research contribute to impact of sustainability goals and what roles for an institute like ours. You can brief yourself about these colleagues by modern media. No further praising introductions from me. It would come at the cost of your discussion time. They have 7 minutes each. We listen to them. Then it's your turn. And I look forward to debate. Francis, please take the floor.
Right. Well, it's a great privilege to be here, and I feel that we're contributing to the global consultative. We're contributing to the global consultative debate on issues, which is how global goals will be determined. The 2000 global agreement started with a declaration, and the world leaders agreed to spare no effort to free our fellow men and women and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty. And I think this declaration is a great declaration. You should read the whole thing, but it remains totally valid. Of course, since then, we've had the goals and we've gone far towards the end of the period. And there's been mixed performance. Some countries managed to make it, some goals were achieved, others weren't. And there are a number of countries which are so-called off track, didn't succeed, including many in Africa. There's also been some criticism of the first set of goals, including the fact that they talked about quantity, not quality. For example, in education, you have great expansion of education, but many children can't even read a sentence when they leave school. The economy was left out, distribution was left out, employment was left out, and the goals were not universal. And above all, there was insufficient emphasis on sustainability. There was also criticism of the process, because the goals were in a way imposed by a very small group of people and not the result of a global consultative period. So now we move on to what do we do next. And I think the first thing we have to decide is, do we want some goals? Well, I think we definitely do, because it would be a sort of declaration of failure, a declaration of a lack of a global commitment if we now abandoned goals. So it's important that we come to a new set of goals. The high-level panel, which my neighbour's been very active in, has recommended 5 principles for the new goals. Leave no one behind. Everyone should have access to certain basic human rights. And I would certainly agree with that. Put sustainable development at the core. I think this is critically important, that we must have one set of goals which includes sustainable development. Third, transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth. That depends very much on how we interpret that one, but yes. I'm a bit less happy with the 4th one. Build peace and effective and open and accountable institutions for all. Of course I want to do that. But I feel that when you get to the details, it becomes rather politically intrusive, and it's for countries themselves to determine these things and not for global goals. And then finally, there's a lot about forging a global partnership, which in my view is more about words than it doesn't mean anything. It'll mean something if people do take up this partnership. So I would stick at the first 3 principles. Leave no one behind, put sustainable development at the core. Transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth, but I would add some. First, I think the goals should be universal. They should apply to the North as well as the South. I think that was part of the panel's intention, but we really should this time. Last time this was not the case. The North's only commitment was to help the South. It wasn't a commitment to solve its own problems, of which we know are now very large. Secondly, I think distribution should be much more fundamental, much more central to the goals than they weren't ignored before. And now the big focus is still on eliminating poverty, which of course we want, but I think distribution is critical. Then thirdly, the process should be participatory. And not only participatory, but I think in the end of the day, each country should determine its own goals against a set of principles. So given the principles I've outlined, each country should, in my view, determine its own goals so that they're not imposed from outside. They should report internationally, so it's seen that they are making an effort, and they should report on their achievement. But I feel different goals are appropriate for each country, and it's very difficult for a central global institution to suggest global goals. Finally, let me just say something very briefly about what this involves for research. The most important research issue is how we reconcile growth and sustainability. And at the end of the day, I really think that it may turn out it's not reconcilable. I think we should leave the south of growth, and the north should consider how it can change its pattern of development so as not to require continuous growth. I think that this would have a lot of advantages. But then the question is, can we make this work in a capitalist economy? What patterns of development are possible for poor countries, and so on? So there's a big research agenda there. Second big research agenda, how do we create jobs? Everyone includes jobs in the agenda, but they don't say how. It could be massive growth, but that goes against sustainability. Labour intensity of production is a possibility, and a more service and serving economy, which employs more people. But that has implications for taxing in order to increase revenue and support such services. And then I think finally the research agenda is, what are fair targets in terms of sustainable growth for countries at different levels of development? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francis. Tanya Forward, it's your turn. We will for sure come back to the agenda laid out, but feel free to also react to previous speakers on the panel. We heard Francis Stewart critiquing number 4 and 5 of what the people you were supporting have worked out. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. So it's really challenging not only to react to the previous speakers, but to do all this in 7 minutes. So I tried to reduce what we did the last year, working on the high-level panel. And I'd like to structure my words along 3 questions. First of all, I would like to tell you very shortly about what was the mandate of the high-level panel. Secondly, what are the main messages, and then I try to react on you. And and what could be scientific questions, what we from the government think would be helpful to prepare the things to decide from the politicians. So first of all, what was the mandate of the high-level panel? I've brought some copies of our proposals. They are outside on the table. Who wants to have some paper and not only the electronic version? So this high-level panel was consisting of 27 persons from all over the world. And it was an interesting mixture of people who are from research areas, people who are from the NGOs, people who are working in governments. So you can imagine that a group of 27, even if they come from the same area, are difficult to handle. And if they come from different regions in the world and different backgrounds, it was really challenging to find a way and a language to work together. So our task was not only to replace the MDGs, but to work on an advanced and extended proposal, and to take the experiences we had with the MDGs, which has been very good, to take them into a new agenda and to try to reduce the lags which have been in the set of goals. This panel was chaired by 3 political leaders from Indonesia, Liberia and the UK, so Yudhyohunu, Johnson Sirleaf and Cameron. And that in itself was a very interesting mixture, so it represented the interest quite well, as we found in the discussions we had. The former president of Germany, Professor Horst Köhler, was the representative from Germany, but he was picked as in his personal ambition. So we had to find a way between his agenda, what he thought would be very helpful for the new framework, and the government position. So that was interesting in itself, and I think at the end it was interesting that both of it was very close together. So our report was written in less than 9 months. To be honest, we wrote on it 3 months, and whoever thought about this procedure was someone who must be in the UN or a ministry or something like that, because it was really almost impossible to really come to the ground to have some evidence-based decisions. I think, or we all think, we have managed it quite well, but it could have been helpful to have 3 more months to talk about some of the issues which are very tricky and very interconnected. Some more rounds. So what are the main messages of the report? The high-level panel released a vision, and this vision was the job description we had from Ban Ki-moon. It is called to bring 2 of the biggest global challenges together. On the one hand, to eradicate extreme poverty worldwide within a decade or 2, and at the same time to ensure sustainable development within planetary boundaries. We tried to find a way to make a recommendation for a comprehensive framework, and we decided at the end not to use the term Sustainable Development Goals for our agenda. We had a proposal where we had this, but we decided it's very important to have the poverty aspect in the first draft, and because we have the real process, we have the real documents, and the SDG agenda is very broad, so we have to carefully take into consideration that the poverty aspect will not drop somewhere under the table. So that is why we did it like this, and we recommended 5 transformative shifts, as Francis already said. So I don't want to recall them all, but I want to say some few words about it. So first of all was leave no one behind. We have been criticized for that there is no equity aspect in our proposal. And we feel that that is not right, because equity was one of the main issues we discussed, and it's laid down in this headline, leave no one behind. So we have to commit ourselves to reach everybody and to champion for equality and non-discrimination. And it engages for equality of opportunities. Equality of opportunities, that's it. We are not considering that everybody has to get the same ways of living or opportunities, but we think that everybody has to get the opportunity to develop himself, to have a surrounding way they can live without violence, and where you can go ahead with your life. So what does this mean? That means that all indicators we have to define have to be able to be disaggregated and tracked with respect to income, so the bottom 20%, but at the same time to be tracked with respect to gender, location, age, people living with disabilities, and relevant social groups. This is really challenging, and that is behind this headline. So, the framework will only be considered as achieved if the indicators can give an answer to these aspects. So second, put sustainability at the core. I think I don't have to add anything what Francis said. You all know that. But what is behind that and what will be in a big discussion, I think, in the northern countries is how can the northern countries contribute to the sustainable patterns of production and consumption, and what will be the growth agenda in the world. We believe, the German team, that growth could be at 1 to 2% the next decade, and that would be fine if it's balanced. Third, transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth. The panel argues that the profound economic transformation is highly important to end extreme poverty and to improve livelihoods by harnessing innovation, technology, and the potential of business. More diverse economies, especially in Africa, for example, with equal opportunities for all, can be the driver for social inclusion, especially for young people. We have this youth bulge which is coming up in Africa, and our team has argued that the job issue is one of the main pillars of the future framework. That means we have to look for business models which is labor intensive. We have to look for value change. Where are they located, in which part of the countries? This is very tricky. We have been papered for that, and we are very happy that it's in the framework. It was one of our main issues. Fourth, build peace and effective societies. I want to make it short because this could be a discussion for itself. So coming to the fifth and coming back to what Francis said, form a new global partnership. That sounds like you said it could be understood that it's only words. And we have the Busan partnership, and we have many partnerships all over. So what is behind that? First of all, we have written a paper on the global partnership as we understand it and as we proposed it to the panel. There was a very hard discussion on it, because if you go for the track of a global partnership, you have a very broad agenda. And some governments are interested in having a very narrow MDG agenda. That's for political reasons. But we believe there are enablers. For example, this is a part of the global partnership. There are enablers which have to be included into a framework because they delete all the efforts in other areas if you don't have them in your picture. So 3 of them are the ones we have been arguing for. First of all, it's climate change. Second is financial stability. And the third is world trade regulations. Second aspect, which we think is more than only words, is the spirit. We have to find a new spirit of solidarity. It's very easily said that the interdependencies between the sectors and the countries and the businesses and everything is part of the global development. It's very easily said, but what's the political answer to it? That we have responsibilities to this agenda. It's not only about rights, but it's about responsibilities. And not only of governments we believe that the national governments have a very strong role in this framework, but it's about actors. It's about civil society, it's about business, it's about researchers, of course. And this is a new approach. It's very different to the MDG agenda. Third, I would like to pick out another thing.
I need to rush you a little bit now.
We have to call for a monitoring system, monitoring mechanism on the UN level, because if there's no monitoring on the global issues, we think the framework will not succeed. Okay, let me give you 2 sentences what from our part could be interesting to get some answers from the research side. We think it's worthwhile to work with the SDSN network, which has been launched at the same time like the high-level panel, that there is a network of researchers which are working together worldwide. It's run by Jeffrey Sachs. And the second is, we think that the nexus, which is one of the main pillars of the new agenda, is one aspect which could be in different areas of research of the center of consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this was very helpful to get the insights and background from the high-level panel perspectives. Bina, may I call on you?
Yep.
Is your statement?
Right. There has to be equity here. Thank you very much. I think this is very pleased to be part of this panel and to have all of you here to respond. Joachim particularly wanted me to talk a little bit from the southern perspective, which I will do. And just to make it more of a sort of debate, instead of talking about sustainable development, let me talk about environmental sustainability and human development goals, and the possibilities of, he said, what is the possibility of integration? Potentially, of course, there is possibilities of both synergy and dissonance between environmental sustainability and human development. Broadly, if you take human development as Amartya Sen and others talk about it, the economic freedoms, freedom from poverty, hunger, and so on, social opportunities, education and health, and political freedoms, which I think are very important. Now, potentially, what I'd like to argue is that whether there is synergy or dissonance depends a great deal on whether sustainability goals are moderate or extreme, and secondly, what political, technological, and institutional mechanisms that we use to fulfill them. I do want to bring in the whole issue of institutions because we haven't talked enough about that. Now, although Frances talked about let the South grow, but she and I have had so many, I think it's on the same side, that we need to go beyond, even within the South, that there are various ways by which the South can grow, and there are potential synergies between environmental sustainability and human development, which we need to tap. So for instance, just as a few examples, there would be synergy, say, between the protection of forests and poverty reduction, because such large parts of our population are still based in rural areas in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Large parts of the poor are still based in rural areas, and there is synergy between forests and the kinds of ecosystems and services which they provide for everyday living, firewood, fodder, food items, and so on, plus the larger aspect of the complementarity, say, between food security and forests, again, in relation to water catchments, to soil protection, and so on. So this is one kind of synergy which is extremely important. There is also synergy between social goals, education, skills, knowledge, which can be key to sustainability. So for instance, Frances was quite right in talking about, we've only talked about quantity, enrollments, we don't ever talk about quality. But then quality can be more than just the fact that, okay, by class 4 you can do your math properly, which of course we can't at the moment, but also it can be about your attitudes, about clean environment, how much are environmental goals actually built into your educational system, the way you think about the environment. Do we actually think of the quality of a life as complementary to environment? Is it not the case that being in a green area is just as important as being, I don't know, in an air-conditioned office or something like that? So why, building in the way we think about the quality of life as in sync with the quality of nature that we have around us. Health, of course, again, there's a lot of synergy. Clean environment, there's the issue of chemicals in food security, food diversity systems. But there's also the whole question of indoor air pollution. Now, it was touched on in the MDGs at one point. I don't know where it is at in terms of pollution, but this has major implications for large numbers of poor, especially women and children. Do you know that women in India, for instance, the likelihood, the probability of them getting respiratory infections and of dying with them is 50% greater than for men. Something like 200 to 300 infants die every year just because of being in smoky kitchens. So these are sort of huge issues which have synergy. And then there is, of course, the question of political freedoms. Do we talk in favor of environmental sustainability or against it? But, and of course, there is dissonance. And this is partly, of course, between growth and the possibility of achieving this. Now, I think there's general agreement that growth is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for human development. One can also argue that a clean environment is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the quality of life. And here, I think this distinction I want to make between extreme environmental sustainability goals and moderate ones does come into play when you're talking from the perspective of the South. Because I certainly, not many of us believe that we can just put aside environmental concerns. Mining is a very good example of this. So in recent years, we have had a lot of environmental activism, which has led to not finding a bimedia on how do we deal with mining. There's iron ore mining. Iron ore is mined usually from one small area. We export. It's a major part of export. Just in one part, Goa. Some of you may know Goa. More than 1/5 of our iron ore has been exported from Goa, mainly to China. And with public action, you find that there's a complete stoppage of all mining. There's been other more contentious forms of mining where you have forests above, minerals below, and you have tribal populations. And these are real trade-offs, because if you mine, you destroy the forests, and the poorest populations get displaced. But one must also, and where do the trade-offs come in? Because mining also employs large numbers of people. So there is an employment trade-off. In the case of iron ore, for instance, there's been for 1 year of stoppage, there's been huge numbers of layoffs. So I think these sorts of questions come in, not just in the standard way, but when you actually see how environmental goals get implemented on the ground. In agriculture, I think there's a huge issue about, do we use chemicals, non-chemical, partial chemicals versus organic agriculture. Now we know that we would like to move towards organic farming. It's good for health, it's good for the soils, it's good for environmental and human health, but then how do we actually deal with it in relation to productivity? In industry, there's the issue of environmental certification. So I'm just flagging a few bullet points here. I mean, under each of these questions are large questions of global debate and internal debate. And finally, there's a point which is often not mentioned, that there can be a dissonance between your environmental sustainability goals and democratic choice. So for instance, let's take the whole issue of farmers' choices. I was looking at the figures. There's World of Organic Agriculture data, interestingly, and that says 0.6% of agricultural land in India is certified under organic production. It's less in China, 0.36%, it's 0.27% in Brazil. Now, of course, these are grossly underestimated figures insofar as default options for most poor farmers are that they're organic because they can't afford to use chemical fertilizers, but they're not doing so not out of choice. So this question does remain, if people have an equal say, shouldn't they be allowed to go their own way, or should they not? How do you do that? Lots of farmers would choose otherwise. So can we integrate this? We have potential synergy, and we have dissonance and disparities. Can we tap the synergies? Now I'd like to just flag a few points. That yes, in terms of policy, I think we need more moderate rather than extreme sustainability goals, so that they are in some ways in sync with our growth goals. But there are questions of corporate social responsibility as well, which come in. So for instance, people are displaced by mining, then what do we do? I mean, we've been talking about this for years, but how much has been done on the ground is a major issue. This question of technology, I think that's very important, both at the level of, say, polluting industries and so on, but both at that level and at the other level, which is clean cooking fuels. What are the technologies? I think it's very important to start where the poor are. So let's not just talk, it's very easy to talk about, let's have solar panels. Solar is a good substitute for cooking energy. But is it the case? If you actually go into any of the villages in India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Bangladesh, in these little huts, perhaps we have to move the other scale, which is biogas plants, which are feasible, that's clean and green, and it is possible. And how do we then talk about institutions? I think there's a huge amount of synergy in relation to institutions. And I'll give you this example. It's an area I've worked on for many years. It's the whole issue of, say, forest protection and regeneration. Now, we know that forests are important ecosystems, they're carbon sinks, and so on. And there was a time in the 80s when most forests, there was gross state failure because forests were under state management and were hugely declining. Now, one of the important shifts which in the early 90s, at least 50 countries in Asia moved in that direction, and other parts, and also parts of Africa, which is co-management arrangements. You transfer degraded forest land to village communities to protect and manage. And you can see the results of that. Just taking figures from India from 1991 to 2001, we increased our forest cover. This is very important. It's not administrative area under forest, but forest cover, canopy cover, by 3.6 million hectares, which was declining by over 1 million hectares per year prior to that. Now this is predominantly a result of institutional change, where you begin to see communities as protectors and not predators. And there are other examples. So although we talk about global cooperation, solidarity, I think equally important is to talk about cooperation at the local level. Forest is one example. I would say let's also talk about small farmer cooperation for food security purposes within countries. Because very, very tiny farmers with less than 2 hectares are not able to take advantage of the technological skill and other innovations which are out there. And then can we talk about regional food securities? So I think cooperation needs to be a very important part of the way we think about and I would say cooperation, solidarity is important, but cooperation is particularly important because it allows for difference and sorting out of difference. And finally, a couple of points, and I end there, Joachim, is the question of democracy and the role that can be played both by civil society, but I think the media globally. What happens across the world has implications. Quality of life, take quality of life. Sweatshirts have become common everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter, it's cross-class, it's whether you're an American kid or an Indian kid or Bangladeshi kid. No, part of this, I'm just giving you one example which we see around us. It's possible for lifestyles to change, and I think the West can do a great deal in changing lifestyles, in moving away to simpler lifestyles. They have a great impact globally on younger people elsewhere. So I think all of this, therefore, insofar as research is concerned, we need, of course, research in technology, and we need research in relation to the impact of existing policies. But I think we do need much more research in the institutions which bring in all these three together: technology, policy, and the nature of institutions. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Bina. I'm happy to welcome Professor Ernest Aryeetey. Ernest, you can leisurely settle down here. I asked another speaker first to speak before you, and then call on you. Professor Aryeetey is Vice Chancellor of Ghana University, Accra, Legon, a leading economist from Africa, and for sure will have a focus in his remarks on Africa. Carolina, I would like to ask you to speak now, and you will bring in the climate change agenda. Currently we have a little technology problem, so I hand this microphone over to you.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to read what I want to say in order to keep it short and clear. And I would like to start with this nice paragraph of the Rio+20 outcome document that proposed that the sustainability development goals must be action-oriented, concise and easy to communicate, limited in number, aspirational, global in nature, and universally applicable to all countries, while taking into account different national realities, capacities, and level of development, and respecting national policies and priorities. Meeting all of these requirements will be a challenge. It is then crucial that the best available research underpins the development of the goals, targets, and indicators at global, regional, and national levels. However, a major difficulty is the interdisciplinary nature of sustainable development. It cuts across economic, environmental, and social dimensions in ways that are not well understood. Understanding of climate change, for example, will be necessary to define measures across water, food, and energy security. It is needed to draw on the best available knowledge to analyze these linkages, possible synergies, and trade-offs. Such research development requires new and innovative research frameworks. Recently, I would like to mention that a new international initiative, Future Earth, has been launched, which is a 10-year international research program that will provide critical knowledge required for societies to face the challenges posed by global environmental change and to identify opportunities for a transition to global sustainability. It is intended to deliver science of the highest quality, integrating as necessary different disciplines from natural, social, engineering, and human sciences. Future Earth is being established as a unique alliance, including researchers, funders, and users of knowledge, comprising the International Council of Science, ICSU, the International Social Science Council, ISSC, the Belmont Forum of Research Funders, UNEP, UNU, and UNESCO, with the World Meteorological Organization supportive and actively involved in the establishment of Future Earth. Future Earth will build on the strength of the current 5 global environmental change programs and is aimed to be fully operational in 2014. An article recently published in Nature by Dave Griggs et al. Is an early example of the solution-oriented work that Future Earth will undertake, with interdisciplinary teams of scientists coming together across international borders. Griggs and co-authors argue that the protection of Earth's life support system and poverty reduction must be the twin priority for the Sustainable Development Goals. It is not enough simply to extend the MDGs, because humans are transforming the planet in ways that could undermine development gains. As mounting research shows, the stable functioning of Earth systems, including the atmosphere, ocean, forest, waterways, biodiversity, and biogeochemical cycles, is a prerequisite for a thriving global society. Defining a unifying set of developing goals is challenging, especially where there can be conflict between individual goals, such as energy provision and climate change prevention. But Griggs and co-authors show a possible way by combining the developing goals with global environmental targets drawn from science, and from existing international agreements. And the set of development goals could be defined and implemented. Growing evidence and real-world changes convincingly show that humanity is driving global environmental change. Water shortage, extreme weather, deteriorating conditions for food production, ecosystem loss, ocean acidification, and sea level rise are real dangers that could threaten development and trigger humanitarian crises across the globe. By coordinating actions internationally, the development goals can address this risk. The targets for the development goals should be measurable based on the latest research and should apply to developed and developing countries. To set appropriate goals and targets, Greeks and co-authors recommend that environmental conditions have also to be identified that enable prosperous human development and set tolerable ranges for the biosphere to remain in that state. Building on decades of research, planetary boundaries can be defined which would be unsafe to transgress for 9 Earth system processes: climatic change, rate of biodiversity loss, terrestrial and marine, interference with the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, stratospheric ozone depletion, ocean acidification, global freshwater use, change in land use, chemical pollution, and atmospheric aerosol loading. Adapting these planetary boundaries using credible scientific studies and existing international processes, such as, for example, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a list of sustainable planetary must-haves for human prosperity can be defined, like, for example, material use, clean air, nutrient cycles, hydrological cycles, ecosystem service, biodiversity, and climate stability. They should be taken in consideration in order to produce the Sustainable Development Goals. However, there are still many gaps and uncertainties in our knowledge of global environmental risk and how to enable societies to become resource efficient, sustainable, and wealthy. Therefore, research initiatives such as Future Earth are needed to refine targets and provide sustainable solutions for human well-being. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, Carolina. Could you pass on the microphone to Ernest? Ernest, I'm glad you were able to catch up with us. We had a statement at the beginning from Francis Stewart laying out the debate issues on goals and a brief review of the 5 strategic areas identified by the high-level panel of experts. I think you walked in when Bina was talking. We had Tanya Rödiger-Vorwerk reviewing the debate before the international community as well, and briefing us as an insider on the high-level panel document with its 5 sets of goal-related strategies. We'd love to hear from you from Africa, with an African perspective and what role is science to get us goals which are meaningful.
Thank you very much, Joachim. And, I think I share many of the things that I've heard so far. I walked into the room to hear Bina talk about all the possible areas in which we could focus our attention. There's no doubt in my mind that in the last decade and a half, as a result of the global development goals through the MDGs, we've seen a lot of change in many countries, especially in Africa. This is not often acknowledged, but the Africa that I see today is quite different from the Africa that was there 15 years ago or 20 years ago. A large part of that change is attributable to a pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals. So we've seen improvements in health and improvements in education. We've seen improvements in environmental management and so on. These are by no means really where we want to be. There's still a very long way to go. But the challenges that African countries face have changed in scope as a result of the more recent improvements. Today, there are many African countries that grow more than 7% per annum. Today, urbanization is a much bigger issue in Africa than it was. Half of the population in African countries live in cities, large cities. The nature of African cities has changed. The type of issues, the environmental issues, the crime issues, the various other challenges with traffic and so on are quite different from they were 10 to 15 years ago. So, as we set new goals for human sustainable development, in what way should we take into account the challenges or the changes and the new challenges that they present? One of the things that I struggled with with respect to the MDGs was the fact that the global goals were applicable to all countries in a very uniform manner. And while there were more ambitious countries than others, most saw these as the only things to aspire for. Is it possible, as we look at the new vision for development in terms of global goals, that we perceive them simply as minimum targets that countries may be setting for themselves, as opposed to countries seeing them as the broad maximum to attain? Is there room for letting countries, as they develop their own national development goals, be a bit more flexible, and those that are more ambitious to see the global goals as the minimum to attain, as opposed to the main thing to go for? That way, ambitious countries, full of potential, can have strategies that will lead them make them move faster forward. As I said, Africa has changed, but it hasn't transformed. It hasn't transformed. So today, even though poverty has gone down in many, many countries, we know the source of the poverty drops. They came largely from huge expansions in public expenditures, public consumption. That's where a lot of the drops in poverty came from. We've seen new forms of inequality in many, many countries as a result of the changes taking place. Despite these, we don't see much of employment being generated. Is it possible that in the new development goals, the absence of employment will be the focus or one of the areas to look at? To do that, we need to be talking about transformation of these economies. If we're going to transform these economies, the development goals must focus partly on these. I know that in the discussion for the MDGs, it was extremely difficult to set goals that are more of a direct economic nature relating to growth and to employment and so on. We don't need to have particular targets for growth, and we need to be flexible enough for countries that want to grow faster to have aspirations for that. In the near future, Africa needs transformation, and so the development goals must be reflective of transformation. Anything short of that is not going to lead to the kind of change that we are looking at. Transformation means, therefore, that a green revolution has to be a part of that discussion. And therefore, if we're going to have a green revolution, there must be the appropriate research that is going to contribute to that. The experience of Asia is one that one can learn from in bringing about the African transformation. And therefore, research for to support the development goals must be looking at things that will bring about transformation. And so I talk about a green revolution. To have a green revolution, you need to have people in the various African countries doing research in areas like plant breeding that will support that kind of transformation. We need to be doing work that would improve on irrigation. We need to do work that will bring about the agricultural transformation. Health, we've achieved a lot from the MDGs, but health remains a challenge. Despite the improvements, maternal mortality is still very, very, very high in many, many countries. What kind of research should we be doing to bring about a transformation? I believe African countries need to focus on specific areas. And one area that I would highlight considerably is malaria research. What kind of malaria research needs to be done? There are many groups that have been working for many, many years on a malaria vaccine. It costs money and it's very, very difficult as a result of changes in the way the parasite behaves. Can we focus research on malaria, looking at both the epidemiological issues, the immunological issues, and so on? Another area that we need to focus on, climate change adaptation, doing research there. For many African countries, soils are changing. The soil quality is changing very, very fast. It's not just simply desertification, but as a result of various practices in the way we use land all over the place, we need to do more serious research. We need to do a lot of work on our water bodies. And I'm happy to see that as a result of work that ZEF is doing, some changes are taking place, that many universities in Africa are beginning to think about what kind of work can be done in the area of water bodies. So that kind of work is being done and must be really strengthened and expanded in scope. Another area that I think we need to do a lot of research in is in terms of how we monitor the effectiveness of many of the social protection programs that we've introduced. In the last 2 decades, social protection has been a major part of the effort to overcome the various challenges of countries. So as a result of our pursuit of the MDGs, we've done a lot in health. In many countries today, there are many social protection programs such as free health care for expectant mothers and so on, providing school feeding for school kids and so on. We don't know the impact of these in many, many countries. Can we do serious research that helps to identify the areas where interventions are likely to lead to the best outcomes? So these are 4 areas that have given us research points that we may be pursuing. But the focus of our research in developing countries, especially in Africa, should be on how to bring about transformation of societies and of economies. Once that is done, I'm sure that the human development efforts will not be in vain. I'm quite sure that sustainability of these things will also be much easier to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tanya.
Let me try to briefly wrap up the discussion here. I think there is a general consensus that a new set of goals will be needed post the MDGs. I think there's also general understanding that in some parts the MDGs have been extremely successful. Ernest mentioned malaria research or malaria control. Over the last 10-15 years, especially in tropical Africa, some regions have seen phenomenal success in reductions of malaria incidents. In Eastern and Southern Africa, some regions have experienced a drop of 60, 70, 80% of infection rates, largely due to a massive investment into research, massive investment into public health systems. Yet it's also quite evident that not all of the MDGs have been achieved, and anything that would come post MDGs has to encompass significant elements of the present goals. I think what is also relatively undisputed is the fact that the MDGs were relatively specific, some people would say narrow, and very important aspects have been left out. They were touched upon. Economy, very important aspect, sustainability, and actually governance. And I guess there is general agreement that these areas have to be taken up in any kind of new framework that will exist post 2015. Carolina mentioned the Future Earth initiative. Tanya mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals Network. 2 important initiatives that try to bring research into the arena and try to steer the research debate. I think if we look at these two movements and other attempts to develop sustainable development goals, one keyword comes to my mind, which is interdisciplinarity. Again, I think this is a general consensus that any new development post-MDG will be far more interdisciplinary by nature, and sustainable, or research on sustainable development by definition, is an interdisciplinary one. And looking at the design of ZEF, and I come back to what role for ZEF, looking at the design of ZEF and looking at similar institutions like that, ZEF, they are more or less predetermined to take a very active role in the forthcoming research agenda because of their interdisciplinary design. With these few words, I hand it back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A little round of applause to our esteemed panelists. If you would like to ask them a question or confront them with your comment, don't ask just loyal questions, give your comments. This is the time. So I see a hand here, we'll walk around. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, hello, my name is Niklas Bamler here at the ZEF Department of Political and Cultural Change. What I wanted to ask was the first two speakers, Mrs. Stewart and Mrs. Rödiger-Vorwerk. I find what you said as your new goals quite vague, because you were talking about giving chances to people, not necessarily really fulfilling them. On the other side, I also found that you are making a little bit of a Malthusian argument there when you say that your goals should be set within the planetary boundaries. And I think what you're doing there is setting then efficiency, economic efficiency and jobs instead as the goals to look at. But is that not quite limited? And if you're trying to make a social system work in a different way, is not democracy and also institutional inefficiency, elite capture, rather a subject to look at instead of focusing on natural sciences and neglecting social sciences?
Thank you. Please take notes. We want to listen a bit more to audience first. Audience, well, here is the speaker's corner. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Carsten Schulz, also from ZEF Center for Development Research. I have a question concerning how to reconcile the growth paradigm with sustainable development goals. To me, it seems as if there is a real difficulty concerning economic interests of growth, of lobby interests, and since the 60s, 70s, this discussion has been around, and we haven't really made any progress against these strong interests, because their first interest is to make profits, not to protect the environment. And shouldn't that be at the core of our institutional discussion? And what do you think about this? Thank you.
Okay. Well, you took note. Please, former board member of ZEF, Willy Wapenhans, former vice president World Bank.
Thank you for sending me the introduction. I was very intrigued to listen to the board, and as a plan, we sort of questioning not questioning, but re-raising the juxtaposition of growth in the south and growth in the north. That reminded me of a remark that Cardinal Newman made, the former Bishop of New York. He once said, "The only evidence of life is growth." And thinking about that, I would like to pose a question to the panel as to whether we have the right definition of growth. Is a more efficient use of resources and thereby lesser resources, is that growth? Or, as Mr. Borgemeister said, the eradication of malaria, is that not growth? And how do we measure it? So my question is, before we talk about promoting growth in one area of the world versus using it in other parts of the world in descriptive terms, in other words. Should we not inquire as to what we mean by growth when we talk about sustainable development?
Okay. I'm sure we hear something on inclusive growth and this more sophisticated question. I walk here a bit back to be encouraging board member Monica Kaufleser.
Yeah, I wonder why there is so little geographical concept in what is being presented. Poverty today does not occur in averages countrywide. It is a particular slum in a particular city. It is a particularly poor mountain area in otherwise maybe already better income country. And we can see this by the pixel, and you can measure whether child mortality in the next so many years goes down in these spots, in these poverty hotspots. And I just wonder how you will make those new goals, which are fine, specific and bring them down to earth.
Thank you for that question. While I walk to Ulrich Hiemens, who raised his hand. Just a remark from my side, more than 50% of extreme poor people live in G20 countries by now. Is country the right concept? Francis, you said every country and so on should be free. Shouldn't that be the district or the community? How do we deal with the country concept with these 50% plus in China, Indonesia, Brazil, etc.?
Thank you very much. I have another conceptual question. Whatever you fix in terms of goals, I think it will require then three things in order to achieve these goals. And this is number one, the removal of misguided policies. Number two, new or restructured institutions. And number three, behavioral changes. And the question is, how do we bring about the behavioral changes? I think this is a huge area for research. We have tried in the past to do it by government decree. You are prohibited to do this, that, something else. That didn't work too good, too bad, I think, in the past. The experience with socialist countries is a lesson in that respect. So what we need is incentive, is restructuring of incentive systems. The old economic system works on price incentives. It doesn't seem to lead to what you consider to be a sustainable development path. So what kind of incentive systems do we need? Replacing prices as incentives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrich. Don't worry, this is a research institute, so we ask more questions than giving answers. And we have the board only with us once a year, so don't try to answer it all. More from you is requested or desired. Otherwise, if I don't see...
I would like to point at something else. That's what do you expect from goals? And as I was involved in the original set of MDGs, I have listened well to all the criticism, but I would like to make a clear distinction between theory and practice, and between the world of politics and academia. So what were we confronted with by Kofi Annan? He said in 98, 99, he had two major problems in successive meetings. One was that development assistance had gone down by 50% over the last decade. One. And the second one was that he was convinced that something like sustainable development was very important, but in the last year he had been visited by 100 leaders of governments, different countries, and none of them had mentioned sustainable development. That was the reality. So basically he was asking, can you find a solution? Now for the last one, John Ruggie, who was at the end writing the Millennium Report, did decide to go to Gallup. And Gallup had an interview round in, I think, 75 countries, 60,000 people. And out of this interview round, for the common citizens, equally in developing and developed countries, environmental concerns came on top of the list. And they all thought that their governments were not doing enough on that topic. And so, what do you do? So what we decided, we said, okay, what do you want? We talked with the politicians, and the politicians and the diplomats in New York, they never came beyond either eradication or alleviation of either poverty or hunger. You may choose. And so we said, the reality is more difficult, there are more things. So we took 28 topics, we asked state-of-the-art papers of scientists, because you don't have to do research anymore for the goals. As you don't know yet what should be in the goals, you will not have the time to do the research, to do it. So you have to look at what you had. Carolina said something like that. And then you can find, and then there is a selection process. We had 28 topics in 4 areas: peace, governance and security, environment and development. And you find them back in the Millennium Report, because it says freedom from fear, which is peace and governance, freedom from want, which is development, and sustaining the future. Well, the warm-hearted support of the governments for sustainable development, you can see in how sustaining the future was kind of sidelined in the Millennium Development Goals. The same about governance. Very difficult to bring everyone together on governance rules. No? All the countries of the UN have to decide in the General Assembly that they will support it. So it's very interesting to get all these different things together. So researchers, I think, they should look in particular at the implementation of the goals. And what do you expect from the goals? The goals should be mobilizing in the first place. Mobilizing in a political debate. And just realize yourself that there's a major shortcoming in the political debate. The political debate is on single issues. So today we don't want carbon-based fuels. Tomorrow we discuss that nuclear is very dangerous. The day after we say that biofuels are kind of bringing up the food prices, and we do forget that we need energy at the end of the day. That's the public debate. So I appreciate that from planning theory you need to have goals, and then the implementation, all these things will already be difficult to write this whole thing together, all these different issues that you have to address. The most important thing is when the UN takes a decision in 2015, there need to be goals that are mobilizing. So Kofi was very happy. Sustainable development came back on the agenda. And development aid was doubled in the next 2 or 3 years. So what are we going to do? And Ernest was in fact indicating what did happen in Africa. A lot of change did happen. Because it's mobilizing, it has to be ambitious. And so you have to choose, to select. And scientists can later on write down schemes how to implement it the best way, how to link the different topics, how to make things more worthwhile, how to have different norms for everyone. And no one said that the Millennium Development Goals are only there and to achieve the goal and nothing more. Everyone who can do more, Ernest, is free to do so. Why not? And even after 2050, when we have achieved the goals, it was never meant to say now in 2050 we are ready and now we sit down, there is no growth needed anymore.
Well, thank you. Hans van Ginkel, Chair of the Board of ZEF. Well, colleagues, I'd like to give you a chance to briefly reflect on each other's and on what you have heard in the audience. Don't even try to respond to all of this. Hans, by the way, I feel it's mobilizing already. We were at ZEF since 1997. I do not recall an NDG debate in Bonn in 1999 when you guys were handling that at the UN. So this time around, mobilization from the bottom is happening, and it's debated in India, Africa, China, elsewhere. I think it's a great opportunity. It must not be diluted. I go the other way backwards. Christian, try a minute.
Actually, half a minute. I think that the rallying point that Hans just made is absolutely crucial. The goals that have to be set have to be appealing, have to mobilize support, and have to steer the agenda. They have to be simple, concise, and easy to understand. I think that's, for me, the key point. Karina?
I think I don't have too much to say, but I will try to emphasize the fact that we need regarding the paradigm between growth and sustainable development. We cannot forget that we have reached the dangerous level of numbers of areas, of natural areas, and so we cannot avoid to talk about growth and to keep track of many of the Earth systems threatened areas.
I get the impression that we get a sense of how complicated everything is. So let me try to say some short words. Yes, economic interests and the question what is the well-being and what are the indicators for growth is a tricky issue. And if we're talking about job and livelihoods, that was what we are thinking about. What is a livelihood? What we consider as being worth to live in. So we think that we need other indicators, and there are some proposals made already. I think there are some good proposals made. And what is the aim behind it is that there must be a change of life behaviors and a change of mindset. Somebody have been talking about you have to implement it in schools and whatever, but this is a very strong agenda. So if we have a discussion on it, it's a very good first step. And if we look into where are the poor people living, that's not in very small rural areas, but it's in the emerging economies. But on the other hand, if you look what lifted people out of poverty, it's in the same areas. It's the growth agenda. So how can we fix the framework that the incentive of business is somehow channeled along these questions of well-being and these questions of growth, these questions of planetary boundaries. So this is the main road what we tried to bring the agenda on. Of course, it's a question of mobilization, but I think it's more than that. It should be more than that. We propose these 5 transformative shifts in combination with the 12 goals. And that's not by accident, but that's a conceptual question. If you have some overarching issues which you have to implement in each goal, then that's the reason why we did it. Or if you have them like pillars, sectoral pillars, that's a difference. And we think there is a difference in quality. We think it could be a universal agenda that's a difference to the MDG, cross-sectoral working and thinking on it. And we believe that one of the main actors is business, and that the question of ODA is not the question of the future, but of the past. And the role of the national government is to frame it that the business is not running somewhere where the well-being is not met. And it is a tricky issue of financing as well, especially if we look to the African continent. We issued a paper on illicit flows from Africa. So it's a question of investment, of institutions, and the questions of where do we want to that our money goes to.
Okay, Frances?
Yes, I just like to comment on three aspects very briefly. Redefining growth, that would be fine, and of course it's necessary to see whether we're making progress to redefine it to include all the goals we want. But that doesn't eliminate any conflicts. The conflicts remain, the conflict between old-style growth and our new development areas, and we don't want to disguise those conflicts because they're going to remain. We want to see them and see what we can do to bring out the synergies, whether we redefine growth or not. Secondly, I want to just say something more about distribution and why I think distribution is so important. I think if one sticks just to a very minimal poverty line, which is the present philosophy to eliminate poverty, and doesn't worry about distribution, then continuously the people at the bottom may be getting less well off relative to the top, and we're wanting more and more and more. If we want to solve this problem of continuous growth and always never being satisfied, we have to tackle the distributional issue as well as the poverty issue. And if we want the goals to apply to rich countries as well as poor countries, we have to think about very real poverty in rich countries, which of course are well beyond the $1.25 a day, but they're very poor people who can't participate in society fully and haven't got equal opportunities. And finally, just on the distribution, equal opportunities is fine if one defines that very extensively and carefully. It's often defined to mean people with the same education are able to get the same job and so on. But basically what we want to say is everyone should get the same education, not even just have the opportunity to get it. They must get it. If they've all got the education, they've all got the nourishment, then yes, sure, fair enough, equality of opportunity. But it has very easy to define it in a very narrow way when it involves a lot of real inequality. And then thirdly, I think institutions are at the heart of this dilemma, which was brought up very clearly by the speaker just here, which is that the motivation of the big corporations is to produce new products, to make more profits, and that's not necessarily the good way of going about dealing with the environment. And that was brought out very clearly by Bina in the forestry example, that co-ops, NGOs and so on, alternative institutional models really are going to eventually have to be at the heart of the way we run our economies. The sort of capitalist model has been very effective in bringing the world economy up to a certain level, but now we've reached that level, it's really dysfunctional in the way that it is behaving, and I don't think just global partnership is going to cure that dysfunctionality. So there's a real issue of institutions, which is a long-term issue which we have to tackle country by country, and it's going to be very painful and difficult.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think one of the areas that we need to pay attention to is the transition from the global goals to the national goals. And if we did pay enough attention to that transition, the issue of the geographical space, for example, will be taken care of. It's almost impossible at the global level to target all these pockets of poverty and all the places within both developed and developing countries that are facing severe challenges geographically. These are best done at the national level. So where I think we didn't pay enough attention 15 years ago was how you made that transition. And that brings me to the point that Hans made. I agree with you that at the UN level, nobody mandated a particular maximum set of achievements. I agree with you. But when it came to the implementation at the national level, there were issues there. We all know, as he also pointed out, that in the setting of the MDGs, this was tied to the flow of aid. factors tied to the flow of aid, inevitably. And so when it came to the national level, governments were seeking to do whatever they could do to get more aid. That's what governments were doing. And so in preparing your own national development plans or goals, you were looking at what the UNDP would approve, what the World Bank would approve. That's what governments were doing. I worked with the Ghana government to prepare a development plan, and that was a very strong influence from donors. This is not, when we were focused on transformation and growth, and they were not interested, and effectively putting pressure on the government to ignore that. So through these kinds of national pressures, you lose the ambition to move beyond the global goals. So as we set these new goals, let's tell governments, this is the minimum we are giving you. Feel free, dream, and work towards it.
Okay. Thanks. I'll take a couple of points. Firstly, I really want to reiterate what Francis said. But I'll bring in technology as well, because when we think of the future, we do think of technological breakthroughs, leapfrogging. But technology in itself is just not enough, unless it's linked to institutions. Even if we take something like disease control, we're increasingly learning that what matters is the social networks and institutional forms through which new medicines are disseminated or control of diseases is organized. I'll give you one very interesting example of the link between technology, institutions, and growth. In a very semi-arid area in Western India, in Gujarat, you found that they invested in rainwater harvesting in a very big way. And of course, rainwater harvesting requires community cooperation in developing it. And you've had 10% rate of growth of agriculture for long years in the state, compared to 2.5% in the country as a whole. Now here's one example where you can have growth with the right synergy between technology and institutions. The second is on distribution. Yes, I think, again, equality of opportunity is fine in many cases, but equality of outcomes also sometimes is necessary, and I think sometimes it needs legislation. I mean, take gender equality. Without equality of outcomes means, okay, you do some reservations. We really need a mix of methods to deal with redistribution. The standard mechanisms are just not enough. And finally, I think behavioral issues are absolutely key. How do we change social norms and values? And here I really do believe we need more than goals. We need a vision. We need a vision towards which is inspirational. It's just not enough to say, let's reduce maternal mortality rates. It's just a checklist, in a sense. And do we need to move towards that? Because it will need sacrifice. I think visions need poetry. So I'll use my half a second more to just share with you this very nice lines from the Chipko movement, which is 1972 movement against commercial forestry by local people. Do not axe these oaks and pines, nurture them, protect them. From these trees the earth gets its diversity and the soil gets its water. Look how the rhododendron smiles in the forest. Thank you.
I have a rhododendron in my front yard. Thank you very much. Say again? Oh yes, it did great. It needs a lot of attention. Thank you for your attention, colleagues and panelists. I much appreciate Hans's call to action regarding focus on the political practice side, and don't just look at the MDG, SDG debate from an ivory tower of academia. We don't do that, Hans, I assure you, and we have our board to make sure that we stay close to practice. The optimal level of ambition in the goals, I think, is very important. I think the current MDGs got it right. I recall, like many of you probably, that once they were handed down from New York, many people in the development business said, you are out of your mind. This is totally unrealistic. Cutting poverty in half, cutting hunger in half, cutting mortality by 2/3. Well, many of the you are out of your mind talkers were proven wrong, because it inspired. The poverty goal met at global scale, the hunger goal almost, the mortality goal dismally failed. The worst performance. That's why we feel at ZEF we really need to focus more on the public health issues connected to a broad-based development agenda. What's missing, I think, are lots of new agenda items, which some of you touched upon, and which I think are also found in the high-level panel statements, which I personally find very good, especially the first 3 items. I fully share your assessment, Francis. Without further improving the rule of law, rights of people, government accountability, and personal security of people, lots of the development investments will fail. If we don't get coordinated action on organized crime, I don't know how adaptation to climate change can be managed in West Africa or in parts of East Africa. So we cannot just have a checklist. That was said. I fully agree. And we have to get these very troublesome things which prevent the world from moving forward in certain parts of the globe, need to have that also on the agenda. So I'm delighted to see a lot more talk on rights in the current debate on future goals, women's rights in particular, but also community rights and their rights and incentives to cooperate. Thank you for your participation. A round of applause for our panel.